All right, welcome back to Behind the Bedroom Wall. Today we'll be reading chapters 2 and 3. They're not very long. You'll pause at the end of chapter 2 to answer questions and then continue with chapter 3. Chapter 2. By morning, Corinna still hadn't chosen a name for her new kitten. The black and white mouse catcher raced around in crazy circles and made flying leaps at Corinna's stockinged legs as she dressed. After a cold breakfast of rye bread spread with a thin layer of jam, Corinna left her kitten purring next to the coal stove in the kitchen. "I'm leaving, Mother," Corinna called from the front hall, shouldering her book bag. Frau Rehm came from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a towel, and hugged her daughter. "Come home right after school today. Aunt Hendrikia is coming over for dinner." "I won't forget," Corinna promised as she slipped out into the cold morning air. She pulled the door shut behind her. Corinna stomped her feet to keep warm as Rita and Eva crunched over to her through the snow. "Heil Hitler," Rita called. Corinna returned the greeting. "Heil Hitler. Guess what?" she added as she joined her friends and they continued on toward school. "Papa gave me a kitten to catch the mice I heard. She's the cutest little thing. And look," Corinna stopped walking and angled her calf to show them. "The little monster bit a hole in my stocking." "What does the kitty look like?" Eva asked. "She's black and white and so fuzzy. Maybe you can help me name her." Eva sighed. "I wish I could have a kitty, but of course I don't have any mice in my walls." Corinna shuddered. "I hope the traps really did scare the mice away. What if I ever saw a mouse race across my floor? I'm scared of them." Giggling, Eva said, "I know what I'd do. I'd scream." Corinna nodded. "And I'd—" Rita made an impatient sound in the back of her throat. "Wait until you hear this," she interrupted, slicing her hand through the air for emphasis. "Hans stopped by last night. Guess why Herr Haas was taken away?" "Why?" Corinna asked flatly. "He was involved in a secret organization that helps Jews. He's being taken to the work camp. But first, they're going to try to find out who else is in the organization." Corinna shrugged. "Maybe he'll never say who else was in the organization. My brother says they have methods for extracting secrets out of prisoners." Eva's eyes widened. "He told you all this?" Rita shook her head. "I heard him talking to Papa in the kitchen. They didn't know I was listening." "What kind of methods?" Corinna couldn't help asking. "Secret methods," Rita said, her voice a loud whisper. "Hans isn't even allowed to tell his own father." "And look at this," she continued, taking a small notebook out of her pocket in her coat. Corinna and Eva looked at what Rita had scratched into the book in her messy scrawl. "Fraulein Dimmer has made a face at the Führer's picture," Corinna read out loud. "She says it's a sin what's happening to the Jews. When she sees me, she looks guilty and doesn't say anything more for the rest of the night." Corinna stopped reading suddenly. "Fraulein Dimmer? You mean Elsa Dimmer?" Rita nodded smugly. "But Rita, Elsa's your cousin. You're going to turn in your cousin?" Eva exclaimed. Rita's face turned red. "She's an enemy of Germany, isn't she? She shouldn't be so sympathetic to the enemy. If she weren't so guilty, why did she avoid me for the rest of the night? She knows she's wrong." "But still, Rita, family." Eva started walking again. Corinna put a hand on Eva's shoulder. "Remember, even family members can turn against the new Germany." Rita snapped the small notebook shut. "They said to watch everyone." Corinna nodded. She had a little black notebook just like Rita's. "Hurry up," she said. "We'll be late." They ran the last few hundred meters to the school and quickly made their way to their classroom. Corinna and Eva were desk mates. Rita sat across the room. History was their favorite subject, especially with all the exciting events that were currently taking place. Someday, Corinna knew, every student in the world, every person in the world, in fact, would know the name Adolf Hitler. Everyone would honor and love him as she did, and everyone would say what wonderful things he'd done for Germany, the strongest and greatest power in the world. Corinna smiled, opening her new history book. "Heil Hitler!" Corinna looked up, startled. "I am Herr Rick, your new history teacher. Fraulein Meiser will no longer be here. Today we are going to study." Corinna didn't hear the rest of Herr Rick's comments. Where was Fraulein Meiser? Beautiful Fraulein Meiser with her long blonde braids she wore wound up on her head like an upside-down basket? What had happened to her? Corinna tried to swallow past the lump in her throat. Her eyes slid sideways to Eva. Eva stared forward, but her eyes glimmered with tears and her hands were clasped tightly in front of her. Corinna looked down at the desk. What was it Fraulein Meiser had said last week? She had been instructing the class as to which pages they should paste together in their history books, when, in the middle of it all, she had suddenly sighed and looked at the ceiling. When will this all stop? She had asked the ceiling. When? Then she had shaken her head and continued reading off the list of forbidden pages. Corinna now remembered she had found it disturbing enough to mark it down in her small notebook. And that day after school, she had read her notes to her Jumada leaders. She tried to gloss over this little bit of information about her history teacher, not thinking that it was very important in retrospect. But her leaders had seemed particularly interested in what Fraulein Meiser had said during class that morning. Now Corinna wondered if she had something to do with Fraulein Meiser's disappearance from school. Surely what her teacher had said in class wasn't enough to send her away, or was it? Corinna tried to concentrate on the lesson, but Herrick had a voice that crept along like a slug in her mother's garden. Finally, when the history lesson was over, Corinna followed Eva out of the room for break. Eva, she called. Eva stopped and turned. Do you know why Fraulein Meiser isn't going to teach anymore? Eva shook her head. Somebody probably reported her as being un-German, she said bitterly. Corinna pulled a loose thread on her sweater. She wouldn't be arrested just for saying something that sounded disloyal, would she? Who knows these days? One can never be too careful. Poor Fraulein Meiser. She shook her head and started to walk down the hall. Corinna hurried and walked along beside Eva. I know you feel bad about what we saw yesterday, with their Hass, but you should watch what you say. Rita thinks you're sounding un-German. Eva stopped walking and turned to Corinna. Her lips trembled, and tears threatened to tip over her lower lashes. Eva said slowly, I can't help the way I feel about things. I want a strong and rich fatherland just like my comrades, but sometimes I honestly wonder if it's worth it. Eva! Corinna lowered her voice, quickly looking around, but no one was paying them any attention. You mustn't say things like that. If anyone heard you talking like that, you'd be turned into our Jungmano leaders. You're the only one who heard me, Corinna. Are you going to turn me in? Corinna stared at her friend, her comrade, her fellow Jungmano member. But part of being loyal German was turning in traitors. I'm going back to class, Corinna said abruptly. She turned and walked away from Eva, but she could feel Eva's eyes staring after her. So pause the video right now and answer these 3 questions. 1, why was Herr Haas taken away? 2, what does Corinna think happened to her history teacher? And 3, do you think Corinna will turn Eva in for what Eva said? So hit pause and then meet me back for chapter 3. Chapter 3. When Corinna got home after school, she didn't call out to her mother, whom she heard talking to Aunt Hendrikia in the other room. First, she wanted to find her kitten. Quietly, she took off her boots and hung up her coat in the small front hall. Her father wasn't home yet. She could tell because his big boots weren't in their usual place under the small square mirror hanging on the wall. Corinna slipped past the front room where her mother and aunt sat talking and stepped silently up the narrow stairs to her bedroom. In her room, she deposited her book bag neatly on the floor next to her shrunk. She picked up a ribbon off the floor. How did that get there? She wondered. She bent down and looked under her bed for her kitten. She looked behind her chair and under her small desk. Still stepping softly, Corinna moved next door into her parents' room. Again, she looked under the bed and in various other possible hideaways she thought a kitten might fit into. Here, kitty, kitty, she called softly. Here, kitty, kitty. Nothing. No scratching, no answering meow. With a sigh, Corinna resigned herself to the fact that her kitten must be downstairs in the kitchen or in the front room with her mother. She returned to her room and lay down on her soft feather bed and closed her eyes for just a minute. The subdued murmuring floating up from downstairs soothed her. Corinna! Corinna's eyes flew open. The afternoon glow had vanished from her room, leaving an eerie shroud of darkness in its place. Corinna, her mother said again, are you ill? She walked over and placed a hand on her daughter's forehead. Why didn't you come in and see Auntie? Now she's left. Corinna sat up. Sorry, Mother. I was going to come down, but I must have fallen asleep. Is Aunt Hendrikia angry? I think her feelings were hurt more than anything. Is that why she left so early? I thought she was staying for dinner. She did, Corinna. She's eaten and gone, Frau Rehm said, tucking a loose strand of Corinna's reddish gold hair behind her ear. Corinna gasped. What time is it? Nearly 5. Why didn't you wake me to eat? I let you sleep because I thought you might be ill. I was just tired. Today was a long day. Corinna's stomach rumbled. Is there any food left? She asked hopefully. Frau Ream smiled. There's a plate fixed for you downstairs. Go now while it's still hot. Corinna hugged her mother and trotted downstairs to the kitchen. The bright, warm kitchen smelled of the sweet scent of sugar buns and cake, two extra special treats reserved for days when they had guests, especially now that the price of sugar and shortening was so high and nearly impossible to get thanks to the war. But of course it was worth it, she reminded herself hastily. As her Jumada leaders always said, no sacrifice for the fatherland was too great. Sitting down, she glanced around the small room for her tiny black and white kitten, but she didn't see her. Corinna felt a twinge of disappointment that her kitten hadn't come scrambling for her the minute she walked in the door, and now it even seemed to be hiding on purpose. Corinna quickly finished eating and walked into the front room, the only other room they had downstairs. It was empty. Not even her father filled his overstuffed chair as he did every night after supper, blowing smoke rings at imaginary targets. Checking once more behind the long sofa, Corinna finally gave up her search for her kitten and went back upstairs. Mother, she called, walking into her parents' bedroom. The room was empty. Puzzled, she turned around and walked into her own room. Her mother stood in the middle of the floor, gently stroking the head of her kitten. Where did you find her? And she took the kitten from her mother's hands. She was under your bed, but I checked under the bed. Maybe she slipped in while you were eating. Maybe. She rubbed the silken head. Where's Papa? She asked, changing the subject. He's at a school meeting. Corinna raised her eyebrows. This late? Frau Ream reached over and patted the kitten's tiny head. He came home and left again. You slept through it. When will he be home? Soon, 7 at the latest. What time is it now? Frau Ream checked her watch. 20 until 6. Oh, no! Corinna exclaimed, heading toward the door. What's wrong? Corinna dashed down the stairs, her kitten still clutched in her arms. They hear her speaking on the radio. As her mother... As her mother followed her down, Corinna turned on the old radio to the official station. Already, Adolf Hitler's voice was traveling over the radio waves with a special message for his people. The Jumada leaders had urged all the members to listen to their Führer tonight. Corinna always looked forward to hearing his radio broadcast. She only wished she could see him speak in person. For the rest of the half hour, Corinna sat in front of the radio listening to the Führer's voice. At first, the speech was quiet yet forceful, but soon the voice took on a moving ring. By the end of the speech, Adolf Hitler spoke at the top of his voice over the cheers of his followers. What he said was always the same: destroy the enemy, the Jews, and the radical intellectuals, and out of the misery they were now in, a stronger, more unified Germany would ascend, a Germany without poverty, without unemployment, the Third Reich that would last for 1,000 years. At the end of the speech, Corinna dropped her kitten on the sofa and stood up as it scurried out of the room. She lifted her right arm in a smart salute. Heil Hitler! She looked expectantly at her mother. Frau Ream, sitting on the sofa and darning one of her husband's socks, looked up at her daughter. Heil Hitler, she murmured. Then she went back to her sewing. Corinna smiled and sat down next to her mother. Isn't the Führer wonderful? Mother, weren't you paying attention to him? His speech was wonderful. Frau Ream shrugged slightly, but Corinna caught the subtle movement as she frowned. Frau Ream said, his speeches are all beginning to sound the same. He repeats himself only because he wants us to remember the important things. What important things? Who our enemies are, of course, and what we can look forward to when Germany wins the war and becomes the power it once was, Corinna said, repeating the very words her Jumada leader had said the day before. And our Führer is going to do all this. Of course. Frau Ream put down her sewing. At whose expense? At what cost? Corinna stood up. Mother, I can't believe you're talking like this. Frau Ream gently reached up and took her daughter's hand. Sit down, Corinna. I love the fatherland as much as you, if not more, because I've been alive longer. But you mustn't follow blindly behind great promises. Corinna allowed her mother to pull her down beside her. Mother, how can you question the Führer? Someone might report you. Is that the only reason it's wrong to question what one man is saying? Fear? It's not fear, Mother. It's love and respect. I have nothing to fear from anyone because I'm a loyal German, just like you, Mother. And you should never question the Führer because he's only doing what's best for it. Corinna's mother didn't say anything. She picked up her darning and once again began to sew. Corinna sat silently, watching her mother for a few moments, and finally she said, Rita is going to tell our leaders about her cousin, Elsa Demmer. Her own cousin. Elsa said she felt sorry for our enemies. Who? The English? The French? Corinna picked impatiently at a loose thread on the couch. No, the Jews. Suddenly they heard a muffled crash upstairs. What was that? Corinna whispered, afraid to move. She noticed her mother's face looked pale, as though she had put on too much powder. Stay here, her mother whispered firmly. She stood up and walked out of the room. Corinna heard her mother make her way stealthily up the stairs, then only silence. Corinna didn't move. She strained her ears to hear anything at all. Had someone managed to break in upstairs? Had someone crept in the front door while they'd been listening to the radio? Corinna! Corinna jumped up when her mother called. She raced upstairs. Her mother stood in the large bedroom looking at a fallen brass figure, which normally sat on her father's desk. She cuddled Corinna's kitten. Frau Ream smiled. This little rascal is into mischief already. I don't think she'll be playing with this statue anymore. Corinna bent down and picked up the heavy brass figure and placed it back inside on the desk. Taking the kitten from her mother, she said, "She must be pretty strong to have knocked that thing onto the floor." Mm-hmm. Just then they heard the back door open. "Hello," Arim called, stomping the snow off his boots. "I'm home." Corinna and her mother hurried downstairs to the kitchen. Frau Ream reached up to give her tall husband a kiss on the smooth cheek. "Couldn't you have come in the front door where we have a mat for all this snow?" "The back door was more convenient," he said shortly. He glanced down at his wife, and she said nothing more about it. "Hi, Papa," Corinna said, thinking the back door was rather inconvenient. It led out to a narrow back alley which ran between the tightly packed houses at the edge of the city until it finally emptied out onto a seldomly used road. The road was bordered by occasional houses on one side and a thick forest on the other, and it led immediately out of the city. Why did the school have such a late meeting? How about a kiss first? The meeting was nothing, just some things we had to go over, he said casually. She took her father's coat. Was it about Fräulein Meisser? No. He snapped his scarf over the high back of the kitchen chair and strode into the front room. Corinna glanced at her mother, who avoided her eye but took the coat from her arms. She left to hang it up, and Corinna followed her father into the front room. He sat in his chair with his feet up on a stool, his head back, eyes closed, and a smoking pipe clamped between his teeth. He should have looked restful, but he didn't. He opened his eyes slightly to look at his daughter as Corinna sat down on the opposite couch. He removed the pipe from his mouth. Sometimes it's not good to ask too many questions. You could ask the wrong thing to the wrong person. But I just want to know what happened to Fräulein Meisser. She was my favorite teacher, and she was a good friend. I'll tell you what little I know, Corinna, but you mustn't talk about her to anyone else. Promise? Corinna nodded. Last night, the Gestapo went to her house to arrest her father. She refused to let him go without her. She went with him. You mean she didn't have to go? She wanted to? Her father is old. He may be dying. I expect she wants to be with him in case he needs her. Except I'm afraid she'll find that she'll be separated from her father after all. Why? I doubt they keep the men and women together in the work camps. Corinna shook her head sadly. Then she went for nothing. It wasn't exactly for nothing, Corinna. Then for what? For love? I don't know, Corinna. Maybe there's something even more important than that. Corinna silently agreed that love was important. It was love for the fatherland that had made her turn in her notes on Fräulein Meisser last week. And she loved her parents, and she knew her parents loved her. What could be more important than love? She couldn't imagine. Why was Fräulein Meisser's father arrested? She finally asked. I don't know, and I think it's best not to find out. Then his face brightened slightly, and he smiled at his daughter. Don't you have any schoolwork to do? Corinna stood up. Yes. She walked over and gave her father a hug. I'm glad you're home, Papa. I am too, Corinna. He gave her a fierce hug. Now go do your homework. Corinna kissed her mother in the kitchen, then went upstairs. Her kitten was sleeping in the middle of her bed, and she stroked the silky head once and picked up her book bag, which sat neatly by the side of her bed. For a moment, she just stood there. Hadn't she left her bag next to the shrink? She always left her bag in the same place, next to the wardrobe, not the bed. Her mother must have moved it for some reason. If she thought of it, she'd ask her about it later. She took out her books and sat down quietly at her desk. Deciding which subject to tackle first. Then she heard it, a soft, rhythmic noise that sounded like something trapped behind her wall. Her heart started to race. It was the mice in her walls. They weren't gone after all. She turned to her bed and saw her kitten stretching and washing its paws. Corinna's heart pounded so hard it felt like it was more in the middle of her throat than in her chest somewhere. If only she could find the mouse hole. Her kitten would surely scare the mice away for good. She decided the noise seemed to be coming from the middle of her wall. Holding her breath, she pushed away from her desk and tiptoed to her wardrobe. She crouched down. The back panel of the shrink almost came down to the floor against the wall. Maybe she'd find a concealed mouse hole back there, she thought. Carefully, she pressed her shoulder against the heavy wooden piece of furniture. It wouldn't budge. She pushed again. Nothing. It couldn't be that heavy, she thought with despair. She knew if she could just move her wardrobe, she would find the source of the mouse noises. Corinna straightened up and faced the front of the shrink. She placed one trembling hand on either side of it and pulled. Finally, it seemed to be moving. She tugged a little harder, and the wardrobe moved silently away from the wall a bit more, but only on the right side. The mouse noises stopped. She grabbed her kitten and clutched the squirming animal in her arms. With a thudding heart, she peered around the right back side of the piece of furniture. But there wasn't a little mouse hole leading into the wall. Practically the entire wall behind her wardrobe was missing. Corinna thought her heart would explode in her throat. She dropped her kitten. Frantically, she slammed her shoulder against the wardrobe to close up the gaping black void. That was no mouse hole. There was something much bigger hiding back there. She had smelled the rank smell of unwashed bodies, and she had seen the pale of glow of skin and the gleam of eyes. So you have 3 more questions to answer. What does Corinna think of Hitler or the Führer? What does her mother think of Hitler's speeches? And why did Corinna's history teacher leave? See you tomorrow.